What if I told you there is a silent, global thief that has been operating for over 2 millennia?
Welcome to
A
the
force
story
so
of the
pervasive,
invisible
it has
tax.
stolen from your great-grandparents, your parents, and is actively stealing from you right now, all without a single break-in. This isn't about a shadowy cabal or a complex conspiracy. It's a fundamental, historical mechanism embedded in the very fabric of money itself. Welcome to the story of the invisible tax. Over the next 10 chapters, we will trace its footprints from the debasement of Roman coins to the printing presses of modern central banks, revealing how inflation has been the quietest, most effective wealth transfer in human history. Our story begins not on Wall Street, but in the bustling forums of ancient Rome. The silver denarius, once the bedrock of the Roman economy, held a purity of nearly 95% silver under Emperor Augustus. It was trust made metal. However, as the empire's ambitions and expenses grew, the state faced a chronic budget deficit. War, lavish public games, and a sprawling bureaucracy demanded more money than taxes could provide. The solution was not fiscal responsibility, but a sleight of hand, currency debasement. Emperor Nero, in 64 AD, initiated what would become a 2-century-long habit. He ordered the mint to reduce the silver content in the denarius, mixing in more of the cheaper base metal, copper. The coin looked the same, it felt the same, but its intrinsic value was less. At first, the public didn't notice. Prices didn't spike overnight. But the precedent was set. When the state needed wealth, it could simply dilute the money supply. Successive emperors, from Trajan to Septimius Severus, accelerated this process. By the time of Emperor Caracalla in the 3rd century, the denarius was less than 50% silver. The state could now pay its legions and fund projects with nominally the same number of coins, but each coin represented a smaller claim on real resources, goods, grain, and labor. This was ancient inflation in its purest form, more currency chasing the same amount of goods. The economic consequences were slow but catastrophic. Merchants and citizens, sensing the decline, began to demand more denarii for their goods and services. Savers and pensioners living on fixed incomes, like retired soldiers, found their life savings could buy less and less. A quiet, systemic transfer of wealth occurred. Real value flowed from those who held the old, pure coins, and those on fixed stipends, toward the state, and those who could adjust prices quickly, the merchants and the politically connected. This Roman experiment established the first major historical pattern of inflation. It is politically easier to debase currency than to raise taxes or cut spending. The invisible tax was born, a mechanism where the government could effectively spend without immediately taking, and the entire population would pay through the erosion of their purchasing power. The denarius's journey from pure silver to copper-washed trash is a direct ancestor to our modern monetary policies, proving that the temptation to print one's way out of trouble is a 2,000-year-old addiction. As the Roman economy weakened from within, it set the stage for our next chapter, the medieval alchemists who tried, and failed, to literally create value from nothing. As the Roman Empire fractured, so did its monetary system. Europe entered the Middle Ages, a period often seen as economically backward, but one that provided a crucial laboratory for the evolution of inflation. Without a central imperial authority, the power to coin money became a prized royal privilege. And with that privilege came the same old temptation, seigniorage, the profit made by a mint from producing coins. Kings and lords discovered they could call in all the circulating coins, melt them down, and remint them with less precious metal. They would then return fewer, lighter coins to the people, pocketing the leftover silver or gold. This was debasement by decree. In England, the silver penny of Henry I, 1100 AD, was remarkably pure. But centuries of wars, like the Hundred Years' War, drained royal treasuries. To finance these conflicts, kings like Henry VIII infamously engaged in the Great Debasement of the 1540s. The English coinage's silver content plummeted, leading to rampant price increases and social unrest. Alongside kings, a more mystical group grappled with the nature of value, the alchemists. Their quest to transmute base metals like lead into gold was the ultimate fantasy of creating money from nothing. While they never succeeded, their philosophical struggle mirrored the state's practical one. Both sought to bypass the natural scarcity that gives money its value. The alchemists failed in their labs. but the kings succeeded in their mints, proving that fiat power, the command of the sovereign, could temporarily override economic reality. The primary victims of this medieval inflation were the peasantry and fixed-wage laborers. Their rents and taxes were often demanded in specific, physical coins. When those coins were debased, their lords frequently demanded payment in older, purer coins or in kind, with goods, squeezing them further. Meanwhile, merchants and international bankers, like the early Medici, could navigate this complexity. They understood exchange rates between different coinages and could hedge against debasement, often profiting from the chaos. This era cemented a key lesson. Inflation is a regressive tax. It disproportionately harms the economically vulnerable who lack the means to protect their wealth. The king's financial shortfall was quietly socialized across his entire kingdom, with the burden falling heaviest on those at the bottom. The medieval money supply, though primitive, demonstrated that the tools of inflation were becoming more sophisticated, moving from simple clipping and sweating of coins to systematic royal policy. This set the stage for the next great leap, the birth of paper money, which would detach currency from precious metals entirely and open the floodgates to a new scale of monetary expansion. The concept of paper money often feels like a modern invention, but its first large-scale experiment occurred over 1,000 years ago in Song Dynasty China. By the 11th century, the Song economy was booming, a powerhouse of innovation and trade. The sheer volume of commerce made transporting heavy strings of bronze cash coins and bulky silver seises impractical for merchants. From this logistical challenge emerged the jiaozi, the world's first government-produced paper currency. Initially, the jiaozi was a receipt, a promise note. Merchants could deposit their metal coinage with accredited brokers in the capital, Chengdu, and receive a paper certificate they could redeem elsewhere. It was secure, convenient, and backed 100% by hard currency reserves. The system worked brilliantly, lubricating the wheels of trade. Seeing its success, the Song government made a fateful decision. It nationalized the note issue, creating an official paper money system. This was the birth of true fiat currency in practice, if not yet in name. Fiat comes from the Latin for "let it be done," meaning the money has value because the government decrees it does. The Song state soon discovered the seductive power of the printing press. Facing immense military pressures from northern dynasties like the Jin, the government began to print jiaozi not just to represent existing metal, but to finance its war efforts and deficits. The results were a textbook case of hyperinflation. As the government printed more and more notes to pay soldiers and suppliers, the public's confidence in their redeemability crumbled. The notes became inflated currency. What once could buy a sack of rice soon could not buy a single bowl. The Song tried to reform the system multiple times, introducing new note issues and attempting to enforce their use. But the cycle continued. Fiscal crisis led to money printing, which led to loss of trust and currency collapse. The economic history of the Song provides a critical lesson for our modern central banking systems. The transition from commodity-backed money to credit-based money is incredibly dangerous without discipline. Paper money divorces the medium of exchange from any intrinsic constraint. Its value rests solely on trust in the issuing authority and its promise of scarcity. When that trust is broken by overissuance, the purchasing power evaporates. The Song experiment ultimately failed, contributing to the dynasty's financial weakness. But it left an indelible legacy. It proved that paper currency was possible. The genie was out of the bottle. This technology of monetary expansion would travel west over the centuries, eventually reaching Europe. There, it would merge with new banking concepts, setting the stage for the next great inflationary chapter, the era of central banks and the deliberate management, and often mismanagement, of the money supply for national ends. The 16th century ushered in the age of exploration, and with it, the first truly global inflation event, the price revolution. This was not inflation caused by government debasement, but by a massive exogenous shock to the global money supply. The source? The vast silver mines of Potosí in modern-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico, now part of the Spanish Empire. Following Columbus's voyages, Spanish conquistadores looted immense amounts of gold and silver from the Aztec and Inca empires. But the real deluge began with the discovery of rich silver veins and the development of the patio process. using mercury to extract silver from ore. Suddenly, New World silver flooded into Seville on a scale Europe had never seen. Historians estimate that the European silver stock may have tripled or even quintupled over the 1500s. According to the foundational principles of monetary economics, an increase in the money supply, if the production of goods and services does not keep pace, leads to a general rise in prices. This is exactly what happened. The quantity theory of money, later formalized by economists, played out in real time. The influx of silver was like watering down the wine of the entire European economy. Prices for grain, cloth, and land began a sustained, century-long climb. In England, for instance, the general price level increased roughly sixfold between 1500 and 1650. This had profound social and economic consequences. For landowners who could raise rents and merchants with goods to sell, it was a boon. Their nominal incomes rose. But for wage laborers, peasants, and anyone on a fixed income, it was a disaster. Wages famously lagged behind prices, and this period saw a dramatic fall in real wages, leading to widespread poverty and social upheaval, contributing to events like the English Civil War. The price revolution demonstrated that inflation was no longer just a local or national phenomenon. It could be transmitted through global trade networks. Spanish silver didn't stay in Spain. It flowed east to pay for spices, silks, and porcelain from Asia, spreading inflationary pressure. This era marks the origin of imported inflation. Furthermore, it highlighted the distributional effects of inflation on a grand scale. Wealth was redistributed from the Old World laboring classes and the Spanish crown, which ironically went bankrupt multiple times despite the silver flood, to New World mine owners, European merchants, and those with assets that appreciated. The invisible tax had gone global, a side effect of economic growth and colonial expansion that reshaped the continent. It proved that even real money like silver could cause inflation if its supply grew too quickly, a crucial prelude to understanding the modern world of purely fiat currencies and the complex role of global liquidity. The 19th century, the age of industry and empire, was also the age of modern financial crises. With the establishment of central banks like the Bank of England and the proliferation of private commercial banks, the money supply became more complex. It was no longer just coins in circulation, but also banknotes and deposit accounts, a system of fractional reserve banking where banks lent out more than they held in reserve. This created a powerful engine for both economic growth and inflationary cycles. In periods of optimism, banks would extend credit freely, expanding the credit supply. Entrepreneurs would borrow to build railways, factories, and canals. This led to speculative booms, or manias, where asset prices, like stocks or land, soared. However, this expansion of money and credit often outpaced real economic output. Inevitably, the bubble would burst. A major bankruptcy, a crop failure, or a loss of confidence would trigger a bank run. People would rush to convert their banknotes into gold, the era's monetary standard. Banks, having lent out most of their reserves, would fail. Credit would vanish overnight in a liquidity crisis, causing a deflationary bust. Businesses collapsed, unemployment soared, and prices fell. These boom and bust cycles, the Panic of 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, were devastating. They were essentially periods of asset price inflation followed by monetary deflation. The invisible tax here was more subtle but equally cruel. During the boom, the first recipients of the new bank credit, insiders, industrialists, gained immense wealth as asset prices inflated. The general population saw some benefit through wages, but when the bust came, they bore the brunt through job losses and debt. The debate raged over how to manage this unstable system. The gold standard was seen as a discipline. By tying a currency's value to a specific amount of gold, it theoretically limited a government's ability to print money arbitrarily. It promised price stability and long-term investing. However, its rigidity was its flaw. The money supply was now tied to the fortuitous discovery of gold mines, like the 1849 California gold rush, which caused its own inflation, and could not expand flexibly to meet the needs of a growing economy, often worsening depressions. This century crystallized the central dilemma of modern finance: how to achieve stable growth without the destructive cycles of inflation and deflation. The gold standard provided an anchor, but was too inflexible. Unregulated banking provided fuel for growth, but was prone to catastrophic crashes. The invisible tax manifested as the systemic transfer of wealth from the many to the few during these cyclical panics, a transfer sanctioned by the very architecture of the financial system. This search for stability would lead directly to the most consequential monetary experiment of the 20th century, the complete abandonment of the gold anchor. For most of modern history, the specter of the gold standard loomed large, acting as a brake on unrestrained money printing. But on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon delivered a televised address that would sever the last link between global money and gold, unleashing the fiat era we live in today. This event, known as the Nixon Shock, was the single most important moment for modern inflation. Post-World War II, the world operated under the Bretton Woods system. The US dollar was convertible to gold at $35 an ounce for foreign governments, and all other currencies were pegged to the dollar. It was a gold exchange standard. However, by the late 1960s, the system was straining. The US was running large trade deficits and printing dollars to fund the Vietnam War and Great Society programs. Foreign nations, notably France, began to doubt America's ability to redeem all those dollars for gold. Facing a run on U.S. gold reserves, Nixon made the historic choice. He temporarily suspended dollar convertibility. It was never reinstated. Overnight, the world's premier currency became a pure fiat money. Its value was no longer derived from a physical commodity, but from trust in the U.S. government and the size of the U.S. economy. Other currencies followed suit. The immediate effects were profound. Freed from the constraint of gold, governments and central banks gained unprecedented control over their monetary policy. They could now print money to fight recessions, manage unemployment, and finance deficits without worrying about gold redemption. The proponents hailed it as liberation, allowing for more responsive economic management. However, the 1970s delivered a harsh lesson: great inflation. Without the discipline of gold, and combined with the OPEC oil price shocks, the U.S. and much of the world experienced stagflation, a toxic mix of high inflation and high unemployment. The purchasing power of the dollar eroded rapidly. The Federal Reserve, under Arthur Burns, was accused of being too politically accommodative, allowing the money supply to grow too fast. The Nixon shock fundamentally changed the wealth preservation game. Savers who held cash or low-interest bonds saw their real value melt away. Meanwhile, those who owned inflation hedges like real estate, commodities, and stocks saw their nominal wealth soar. It was a massive, silent transfer from creditors, savers, to debtors, like the government itself, which could now repay its debts in cheaper dollars. This moment established the modern rules: central bank independence, inflation targeting, and the constant management of market expectations became the new religion. The invisible tax was now a permanent, institutionalized feature of the global economy, its rate set not by market discovery of gold, but by committee meetings. The promise was stability, but the risk was a perpetual, low-grade erosion of currency value, a risk we continue to navigate today in an era of even more extreme monetary interventions. Why do societies tolerate a system where their money consistently loses value? The answer lies not in economics alone, but in behavioral psychology. Inflation is accepted, even engineered, because its alternative is often politically more painful, and our minds are wired to misunderstand its effects. First, consider money illusion, a concept identified by economist Irving Fisher. People think in nominal terms, the face value of currency, rather than real terms, what that money can actually buy. A 3% annual raise feels like a gain, even if inflation is 5%, representing a 2% loss in purchasing power. We celebrate a strong stock market hitting new highs in nominal dollars, often ignoring that those gains may merely keep pace with, or even lag behind, currency devaluation. This cognitive bias allows the invisible tax to operate in the shadows. Second, inflation provides a powerful, if deceptive, political tool. Politicians and central bankers often prefer a low, steady rate of inflation, like the common 2% target, for several psychological and practical reasons. It greases the wheels of the economy by encouraging spending over saving, since money tomorrow is worth less than money today. It allows for real wage adjustment without nominal wage cuts. Reducing a worker's pay is politically explosive, but allowing inflation to erode their real wages over time is silent and largely unchallenged. Furthermore, inflation benefits the largest debtor of all, the government. It reduces the real value of public debt. $1 trillion debt is far easier to repay with devalued dollars. This is a subtle form of financial repression, where savers and creditors are forced to subsidize the state. Our perception is also skewed by recency bias and adaptive expectations. After decades of relatively low inflation in the West post-1980s, we came to see it as solved. The trauma of the 1970s faded. This created a psychological anchoring to low rates, making the sudden surge of post-pandemic inflation in the 2020s feel like a shocking betrayal, rather than a historical norm. Central banks actively manage these expectations. Their credibility hinges on convincing the public they will maintain price stability. If people believe the central bank will let inflation run, they will demand higher wages and raise prices preemptively, creating a wage price spiral. The battle against inflation is therefore a battle of narratives and beliefs. This psychological framework explains the societal bargain. We accept a small, steady inflation tax because the perceived alternatives, deflation, stagnation, explicit tax hikes, or mass unemployment, are scarier. We are trading long-term, imperceptible erosion for short-term economic and political stability. However, this bargain rests on control. When inflation expectations become unanchored, as they threaten to do during crises, the silent tax becomes a roaring, visible one, exposing the fragile psychological foundations of our entire monetary system. Understanding this psychology is key to seeing why the invisible tax persists and how it shapes our financial behaviors and political choices. The 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic triggered a radical evolution in the central banking playbook. Faced with economic collapse, policymakers reached for tools of unprecedented scale: quantitative easing, QE, and massive fiscal stimulus. These policies saved economies from depression but also supercharged the inflation of everything in the 2020s, demonstrating the modern mechanisms of the invisible tax. QE is often described as printing money, but it's more precise to call it large-scale asset purchases. A central bank, like the Federal Reserve, creates new digital bank reserves out of thin air and uses them to buy government bonds and other assets from financial institutions. The goal is to flood the system with liquidity, lower long-term interest rates, and encourage lending and investment. After 2008, major central banks' balance sheets ballooned from a few trillion to tens of trillions of dollars. Initially, this didn't cause widespread consumer price inflation. The money largely stayed within the financial system, inflating asset prices, stocks, bonds, and real estate. This created a historic wealth divide. Those who owned assets saw their net worth soar, while those reliant on wages saw modest gains. This was asset price inflation, a stealthier form of the tax, transferring wealth to the already wealthy. The 2020 pandemic response combined ultra-loose monetary policy with direct fiscal stimulus, trillions in government checks, loans, and aid. This time, the money went directly to consumers and businesses. When combined with severe supply chain disruptions and a surge in demand for goods, the result was a broad-based spike in Consumer Price Index, CPI, inflation hitting 40-year highs. The modern inflation of the 2020s revealed new channels for the invisible tax. First, it acted as a regressive tax on the poor, who spend a higher percentage of their income on essentials like food, energy, and rent, which saw the highest inflation. Second, it eroded real savings as interest rates on savings accounts lagged far behind CPI. Third, it created a transfer from lenders to borrowers on existing fixed-rate debt, like mortgages, as debts were repaid with cheaper dollars. This era also introduced the public to concepts like the everything bubble and financial repression, where savers are forced into riskier assets just to preserve capital, as holding cash guarantees a loss. The tools designed to ensure economic stability and full employment had profound, unequal side effects on wealth distribution. The legacy of QE and stimulus is a world more sensitive than ever to central bank policy. Every utterance from the Fed is dissected by financial markets. The invisible tax is no longer just about the quantity of money, but about the velocity of money, global supply chains, and market psychology. It has become a complex, global phenomenon where policy decisions in Washington, Frankfurt, or Tokyo can quietly confiscate the purchasing power of someone on another continent, making personal financial literacy and strategic asset allocation more critical than ever for survival. For 2,000 years, the invisible tax has eroded wealth. But history also provides a playbook for those who seek to defend their purchasing power. Across empires and economic systems, successful wealth preservers have intuitively or deliberately followed core principles that remain valid today. The most fundamental historical lesson is, do not store long-term wealth in the currency being debased. Roman hoarders buried the old, pure denarii, not the new debased ones. Medieval merchants held physical goods or land. During the German hyperinflation of the 1920s, those who held foreign currency or tangible assets survived, while those holding Reichsmarks were wiped out. The modern corollary is understanding that cash, especially in a zero-interest environment, is a melting ice cube. Throughout history, three major asset classes have served as effective inflation hedges: real assets. This includes real estate and land. Their value is tied to a physical thing with inherent utility, and they often appreciate with or faster than inflation. The medieval lord's estate, the post-war suburban home, both provided shelter and acted as a store of value. Precious metals, gold and silver, have been the classic haven for millennia. They are scarce, durable, and universally recognized. While they don't produce income and can be volatile, their long-term track record of preserving real value is unmatched. They are the anti-fiat. Productive business ownership, whether it was a share in a medieval trading voyage, ownership of a 19th century factory, or equities, stocks, in a modern corporation, owning a stake in a productive enterprise is powerful. A good business can raise its prices with inflation, growing its nominal profits and, ideally, its share price over time. The S&P 500 has historically been one of the best long-term hedges. Modern portfolio theory refines these ancient strategies through diversification. Don't put all your wealth in one asset. Spread it across these hedges: some equities, some real estate, perhaps via REITs, a small allocation to gold, and even newer alternatives like cryptocurrencies, which some see as digital gold, though highly speculative. Crucially, history warns against the siren song of speculative bubbles promoted as can't-miss inflation beats. From tulip mania to the dot-com bubble, these often end in disaster. True wealth preservation is a marathon, not a sprint. It requires financial discipline, living below your means, avoiding high-interest debt, which becomes more expensive in real terms if your income doesn't keep up with inflation, and consistently investing a portion of your income. Finally, the most valuable asset you can cultivate is financial education. Understanding monetary history, basic economics, and the strategies outlined here is your first and best line of defense. In a world where the rules of money are constantly being rewritten by central banks and governments, knowledge is the ultimate inflation-protected asset. It allows you to see the invisible tax for what it is and build a portfolio that not only survives but thrives despite it. As we stand today, the 2,000-year narrative of the invisible tax is at another inflection point. The fiat money system born from the Nixon Shock is being challenged by technological and ideological revolutions. The rise of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and the development of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, promise to reshape the landscape of money, with profound implications for inflation and financial sovereignty. Bitcoin was created in direct response to the 2008 financial crisis and the perceived failures of central banks. Its core proposition is digital scarcity, a predetermined, algorithmically enforced supply cap of 21 million coins, making it immune to the debasement that defines fiat history. Proponents hail it as hard money for the digital age, a true store of value and a potential global hedge against monetary inflation. Its decentralized nature removes control from any single government. However, its extreme volatility, energy concerns, and regulatory uncertainty make it a speculative and controversial tool, not yet a stable medium of exchange. In response, governments are developing their own CBDCs. These are not cryptocurrencies, but digital versions of existing national currencies, like a digital dollar or digital euro, issued and controlled by the central bank. Proponents argue CBDCs could make payments more efficient, improve financial inclusion, and give central banks a powerful new tool for monetary policy transmission. But herein lies a potential dark side for the invisible tax. A CBDC could give a central bank unprecedented surveillance over every transaction. More critically, it could allow for direct, programmable monetary policy. Imagine a central bank, to stimulate spending, imposing a negative interest rate directly on your digital wallet, where your balance automatically shrinks if you don't spend it. This would be the most direct, efficient, and inescapable form of the invisible tax ever conceived, inflation by code. The future may see a bifurcation, a dual monetary system. On one side, a state-controlled, highly efficient, but potentially intrusive CBDC system for daily transactions. On the other, decentralized, scarce assets like Bitcoin, gold, and other real assets acting as long-term value preservation vaults outside the system. The next chapter of the invisible tax will be defined by this tension between centralized control and decentralized resistance. Will digital technology finally allow governments to perfect the taxation of money holding, making inflation a precise policy tool? Or will it empower individuals to opt out entirely, resurrecting a form of commodity money in cyberspace? The fundamental lesson of our 2,000-year journey remains. The temptation for those in control of the money supply to dilute it is eternal. The forms change, from clipping coins to printing notes to expanding digital ledgers, but the incentive does not. Your vigilance, your understanding, and your strategic choices in this new digital monetary era will determine whether you remain a victim of history's oldest tax or become a preserver of your own future prosperity. From the sweat of the Roman mint to the silent hum of a server farm mining Bitcoin, the struggle over the integrity of money defines history. The invisible tax of inflation is not an accident. It is the permanent shadow of state power and economic complexity. For 2 millennia, it has quietly transferred wealth, reshaped societies, and tested the ingenuity of those who seek to preserve what they've earned. This isn't just about economics. It's about power, psychology, and survival. The most important takeaway is this: in the long run, money is not a store of value. Assets are. Your financial education, your strategic allocation into real, productive, and scarce assets is your only true defense. The story doesn't end here. If you want to understand the ultimate expression of this historical struggle, you must see what comes next. Our next deep dive is essential. The final debasement: how central bank digital currencies could automate the invisible tax. We'll dissect the blueprints for the digital dollar and the euro, revealing how the next 50 years of monetary policy could make every transaction trackable and every savings account programmable. Don't just understand the past, see the future. Subscribe to Blood Money Files and hit the notification bell, because when the next chapter of monetary history is written, you need to be prepared, not surprised.